This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, we now bring you a discussion on Production-Linked Incentive Scheme and its implications. The participants are Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, Economic Analyst, and Ruchika Chitravanshi, Journalist.
Government introduced the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme some time ago. Addressing a webinar today, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the scheme will boost domestic manufacturing and exports, and it will also increase the production in the country by about $520 billion in the next 5 years. Shubhamoy, can you tell us a little bit about what the PM has talked about today? What are the key takeaways?
What the production-linked incentive scheme is, that we can go into it a little bit later. What the Prime Minister is saying is quite interesting. He is actually setting out a clear number of how much one expects, or rather what the government expects, will be coming up as an addition to the Indian GDP because of the expansion of the PLI scheme. Now that's very significant because it obviously shows that there has been some amount of calculation that has been done about what will be the impact of the scheme on the nation's GDP. As he says that the investments is clear, that's about provisions worth around rupees 2 lakh crores has been made. He is expecting it to give a corresponding boost up to the entire manufacturing sector, or at least the 13 sectors that has been talked about, to about, as you say, $520 billion, which now over 5 years. Now that is a very significantly high number. Why do I say so? Because in India, the rate of growth of the manufacturing sector is been hovering at around not more than 2% over the last few years. To get a $520 billion boost would mean that the government is essentially looking at a production jump of close to something like 10 to 11% per year boost in the manufacturing sector. As you can see, that's a very substantial expectation, and that is where he is sort of pitching for things to happen. And as I said, that's something that is obviously, these are numbers which would not have come out of the hat, but would have been made quite considerably after detailed deliberations. So yes, that is, to me, that is the biggest takeaway, because from there you can look at what is the level of production, what is the level of production growth per year.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, you're saying that a clear number has been put to the expectation now. Just give a little bit of backgrounder about the scheme. The scheme itself will give companies incentives on incremental sales from products manufactured in domestic units. Apart from inviting foreign companies to set shop in India, the scheme will also encourage local companies to expand their manufacturing units in India. This will obviously generate more manufacturing opportunities, more make in India push for the country, as well as create jobs. Shubhamoy, how realistic do you think this figure is? And if you can talk a little bit about what are the sectors that are covered under this scheme now?
Right. So the sectors that have been covered are fairly extensive. I mean, the one which I've talked about most regularly are, of course, the telecom, the automobiles, and the IT sector. But along with, there are the pharmaceutical drugs, there is the textile products, there are products like food products, there are high-efficiency solar PV modules, white goods also, including air conditioners and LEDs, and specialty steel. So, and of course, there's also battery cell production. So, as you can see, this is a widely extensive type of sectors which have been covered. And by any reckoning, these are good sectors to focus on. That these are definitely the sunrise sectors. These are sectors where one can expect a fair amount of production to expand in India. There is clearly a market abroad which the companies can tap into, and there is already a fair amount of what I would call the base that is available with the Indian manufacturers to think of being able to expand production. The interesting thing about PLI is not about more than the sectors, is that in terms of being a scheme, this is a different ballgame from other incentive schemes that the government of India has brought in. Most schemes, or rather all schemes that the government had brought in earlier, were investment schemes, that companies were supposed to raise investments, and based on that, they would get a tax exemption or a tax set-off. The production-linked incentive scheme is totally different. It can be written in just one sheet of paper. It simply says that if your production was X in 2018-19, your production should be Y in the year 2025-26 or 24-25.
Right.
And if it is so, you get an incentive of this percent. Scheme is that it's extremely simple. It's a very easily measurable scheme. And that is what is also the reason why many companies are somewhat hesitant. Without making any aspersions, when you have an investment can include fair amount of things. You can have experts talking about whether a particular item qualifies as an investment, to what extent it qualifies as an investment, put a value to it, and so on and so forth. It's a taxman's delight. A production-linked scheme like this is rather barren and very simple. It simply says that if a company is producing X number of batteries, for instance, it should reach Y level of batteries in this year to qualify. You can't really play around with the numbers there. And since you can't, it helps companies which are extremely aggressive to say, yes, this is what we want, because they are confident about their ability to go the full hog in terms of raising their capacity. But those companies which are not sure and which are, I would say, a bit of a relic of the way we have handled industrial production incentives in India over the decades, they would rather try to fall back on the older things, which is why there's been a lot of this doubt which has often been raised that whether the production targets are feasible, targets should be into in further granular details, and so on.
When you say that the production is increased from X level to Y level, that the government will give incentives, what are these incentives and how will a company be able to avail them? And also, has government kept aside some fund or something also to fund these incentives as well?
That's right. So what it says is that basically the government will give an incentive in terms of pure subsidy. It's not a tax support. It is not, again, to come back to that earlier schemes, the earlier schemes were tax support, that if the company could show a particular level of investment, they could write off their tax. This one is not meant on that. The companies have to show the production. The government has allocated roughly about 2 lakh crore rupees and expects to do more and will be giving out amounts from that depending on the percentage of production that they can raise. So essentially it is a cash support. Now this cash support will, if one looks at it, that how much is it in terms of a company's say profitability or in terms of the company's top line, it actually for most sectors it is coming up to something like 5% or so, which means that the company is able to say that of my total cost, about 5% is being taken care of by the government's subsidy. And why is that? How does one compare this number? Well, roughly it has always been said that, say, a company producing goods in India compared to a goods manufacturer in, say, China or even, Vietnam, we talk about what is the difference in terms of their cost. And they say that it roughly works out to about 10 to 11% costlier to make a product in India compared to a similar product in China. A 5% difference would mean that it's almost halving the difference. In the case of Vietnam, it's actually even more because between India and Vietnam, the difference would be something like 8 to 9%. So it goes even more. So that is where it stands. Again, as I say, these are very simple things to understand, that the government is essentially saying that I'm not able to sort some of your problems. Which are these problems? The problems of higher cost of land, the higher cost of infrastructure, like power, for instance, or the fact that labor productivity in India is not up to standard compared to many of these Asian countries. Labor may be cheaper, but the productivity of the labor is not very high, lack of skills and so on. So instead of that, I'm giving you a cash support. I'm simply saying that you get this amount of cash, which makes up the difference between your cost of your production and what you have now. So, as I said, it's simple, easy to organize, difficult to gain, and therefore probably has a lot going for it.
So you have very nicely laid out what the benefits are and what the things that the scheme does not address. I'm keen to understand, so where does the PLI leave Indian manufacturers and companies vis-a-vis global competition? What do you think it will do some good for us in that sphere?
That's a very important point, Ruchika. That is essentially the issue. If a manufacturer were to sort of, sit in India and to sell only within the Indian market, of course, comparisons would come because there's an import issue. But then somebody could lobby for an import duty and that sort of things could be worked on. But here, we are assuming that the company will be facing competition. And why do I say competition? Because while there have been disquiet on import duties being raised to benefit sectors, the government has also said of late that it is not looking at it as a long-term measure. It will try to soften the import duties. So essentially that means there is a competition going to come from abroad for each of the sectors. whether it's steel, whether it's solar modules, whether it's textiles, pharmaceuticals, and automobiles, and so on. So that means what? That the company has to produce goods which sell at the same price as where her competitors' products coming from, say, the manufacturing center of the world, which is China, or other countries like Taiwan or Vietnam, or even closer to India. So, for instance, we have the foreign trade policy, and the foreign trade policy every year comes out around this time in March or early April. And what does the foreign trade policy recognize? The foreign trade policy recognizes that Indian companies have a competitive disadvantage because of the fact that the factors of production are priced higher, land, labor, capital. To make up for that, the foreign trade policy tries to provide incentives. It either provides incentives through taxes, or it simply tries to provide some sort of incentive as a cashback. But cashbacks are not acceptable under the WTO regime, and incentives under the tax, as I said, always leaves chances of gaming the system. The production-linked incentive is a superior tool in that context, which is why, in fact, India government has withdrawn some of the foreign trade policy-linked support mechanisms like MEIS, because it thinks that money can be used much better if there's a production-linked scheme, which means that you produce a particular amount of goods in a particular number of years, and if you do so, I give you a cash support, and this cash support is WTO compliant. So therefore, it is possible to create incentive schemes for companies to be competitive globally without running afoul of international rules of trade.
PM has said today that in the auto and pharma sector, we will have reduced foreign dependence on auto parts and medical equipment and the raw material that we require. Now, the PLI scheme has been extended to 13 sectors so far. And one of the things that the PM talked about is that reducing compliances. And he said in the webinar today that government aims to reduce 6,000 compliances at central and state level. So, Shubhamoy, while PLI is sort of an opportunity for us to boost our manufacturing sector, how do you see this aspect playing into the overall ease of doing business and making India sort of a business-friendly place?
Ruchika, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Prime Minister has talked about removing constraints in terms of rules that affect producers, and in terms of providing them support in terms of facilitating their movement of their goods across the country. Similarly, we talked about the fact that often rules are written for a particular time, and then those rules stay on in the books, in the law books forever and ever. Those rules don't seem to get erased. And if one after another, those rules come in, and they may be for a short time, but if nobody takes the initiative to erase the rule, what happens is that each one of the rules complying with that raises the cost for a company. And by, as the Prime Minister pointed out, the burden becomes enormous, and companies are forced to include those in the cost of their production, which makes it very difficult for them to be competitive globally.
What do you think needs to be done to complement the PLI scheme now so that we actually make a dent in this space?
There is, of course, a report that has come out from the NITI Aayog, which is saying that the PLI scheme should be expanded to more sectors. At this stage, expanding PLI to more sectors, even though there will be other sectors which need support, would, I think, possibly should take a backseat. And we should look at the winners who are there and try to push them, as they say, hell for leather, so that they can they can bring in the advantages for India massively. The other thing that should happen is that the simplicity of the scheme should be retained. Bureaucrats often enjoy writing in clauses. Of course, they write in because there's a need for putting in checks and balances. But I think the government, going by what the Prime Minister has said, very major point, of cleaning up the rule books, should keep that in mind by not adding in sub-clauses where it is absolutely not necessary. I mean, because the moment you add on these sub-clauses, they become extremely great for interested parties to exploit and to put sun into the movement of the industry.
Thank you so much for explaining this in such a simple way.
Thank you, Ruchika.
You were listening to a discussion on Production-Linked Incentives Scheme and its implications. The participants were Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, Economic Analyst, and Ruchika Chitravanshi, Journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our website newsonair.com.